The sky was burning. Engines screamed above a world already torn apart. In the madness of World War II, mercy had no place, yet it appeared where no one expected it. A downed American pilot, broken and starving, a young Japanese soldier raised to believe mercy was weakness. Their lives collided in a moment that defied war itself. Years later, that soldier would hold his newborn son and whisper a single name, a name that carried across oceans and decades. He named his son Sam, after the American who saved his life. War is supposed to destroy everything human, kindness, empathy, even memory. But some stories prove that even in the darkest places, humanity refuses to die. This is one of those stories. Late in the Pacific War, an American pilot was shot down behind enemy lines. Captured, starved, and beaten, he expected only death. But his life was spared, not by rescue, not by command, but by the quiet courage of a man who should have hated him. A young Japanese soldier, trapped in the same machine of war, risked everything to keep him alive, sneaking food, protecting him from brutality, and defying his own army's rules of honor. No medals, no glory, just compassion in a place that knew none. Decades later, their brief encounter would echo again, through a name, a legacy, and a reunion no one thought possible. This isn't just a war story. It's a reminder of what it means to be human, even when the world forgets. He was 25. Lieutenant Samuel Carter, a pilot in the U.S. Army Air Forces. Handsome, sharp-eyed, the kind of man who wrote short letters home but never quite said how scared he really was. It was late 1944. The Pacific War had reached its fever pitch. Japan was desperate, its skies filled with anti-aircraft guns and kamikaze warnings. Sam was flying escort duty for a formation of bombers headed toward the industrial heart of Japan. At 12,000 feet, the world looked clean, just endless blue and clouds. But beneath that beauty, death waited. The radio crackled. Flak ahead. Moments later, a burst of black smoke tore through the formation. Sam's plane shook violently, a direct hit. Oil splattered across the windshield. Flames spread across the wing. He fought the controls, but the stick felt like iron. The engine coughed once, then went silent. He was falling, was spinning, blind, disoriented. He thought of home, of his wife, Margaret, 7 months pregnant. He'd written her a note that morning. "If I don't come back, tell our baby I love them." The plane hit the ground in a violent explosion that ripped through the forested hills of northern Japan. Somehow Sam survived, thrown clear by the force of the impact. When he opened his eyes, he was lying in the snow. Smoke curled into the sky. He tried to move, but pain shot through his leg. Shrapnel embedded deep in the flesh. Blood soaked his flight suit. The cold bit through his skin, numbing him faster than fear could. For hours he crawled through the wreckage, delirious, calling out into the silent woods. No one answered, only the sound of wind and distant artillery. By evening, footsteps, voices. Japanese soldiers emerged through the trees, rifles aimed, shouting commands he couldn't understand. He tried to raise his hands, but they grabbed him roughly, forcing him to his knees. One of them struck him across the face with a rifle butt. He tasted blood. The world tilted and went black again. When he woke, his wrists were bound with rope. His dog tags were gone, his flight jacket torn away. They marched him down a narrow path through villages burned by war, past children who stared in silence. Sam didn't know where he was being taken, only that every step carried him farther from home and closer to death. But somewhere in that marching column of strangers, there was one man, a young soldier, whose eyes hesitated when they looked at him. A man who would soon make a choice that defied his country, his orders, and his own survival. The choice to save his enemy. His name was Hiroshi Nakamura, a 20-year-old soldier in the Imperial Japanese Army, too young to understand the full meaning of war, and too old to still believe that life would ever return to what it once was. He was born in a small fishing village near Hiroshima, a place where the mornings smelled of salt and seaweed, where the waves carried laughter and not gunfire. His hands had once been roughened by rope and salt, not by a rifle. He grew up helping his father mend nets and listening to his mother hum songs that spoke of patience and mercy. But all of that changed when Japan called its sons to serve. When the conscription letter arrived, Hiroshi's mother sewed his name inside the collar of his uniform. She didn't speak much that night. She only said, Serve with honor, but come home human. That word, human, became his quiet prayer. Training stripped away nearly everything else. In the barracks, instructors barked orders that turned compassion into a sin. They told the recruits that the Americans were demons, soulless invaders who burned villages and laughed while children screamed. They taught him to obey, to kill without hesitation, and to see kindness as betrayal. Yet deep inside, Hiroshi resisted. He had never met an American. He had never seen a monster. When he was sent to a small garrison in northern Japan to guard a prisoner camp, he found a place filled with silence and despair. The war had drained even the guards. Their eyes were tired, their uniforms worn, their faith in victory long gone. Inside the bamboo enclosures were men who barely looked alive, skeletons wrapped in rags, their faces hollow, their voices faint. That was where Hiroshi first saw the American pilot. The man sat motionless, his back against a wooden wall, staring at the ground as though he had already left this world. His clothes were torn, his face bruised, his lips cracked. But he wasn't angry and he wasn't begging. When Hiroshi looked closer, he noticed that the man held something tightly in his hand, a small photograph. On it was a smiling woman and a child yet to be born. The sight pierced through everything Hiroshi had been taught. The enemy in front of him wasn't a demon. He was a husband, a father, a human being clinging to one final memory of love. That night, Hiroshi lay awake listening to the winter wind rattle the thin wooden walls. He couldn't shake the image of that photo or the look in the prisoner's eyes. He thought of his own mother's words, "Come home human." The next morning, as he carried supplies to the officers, he passed the storeroom and stopped. Inside were sacks of rice, food enough to last the soldiers months. He hesitated only a moment before reaching into one sack, taking a handful, and hiding it inside his coat. It was a small, foolish risk. If caught, he could be executed for aiding a prisoner. But in that moment, Hiroshi made a quiet decision that would define the rest of his life. For the first time since the war began, he chose not as a soldier, but as a man. The camp where Lieutenant Sam Carter was held was not a place built for survival. It was a cluster of bamboo huts surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by men who had long forgotten the meaning of compassion. Food was scarce, disease was constant, and punishment was routine. Every day began with the sound of shouting and ended with silence, the kind of silence that comes when pain becomes ordinary. Sam had arrived weak and wounded, and within weeks his body began to break under the weight of starvation. His hands trembled from exhaustion, his wounds festered, and his once clear blue eyes dulled into a gray that matched the ash-laden sky above the camp. The guards treated the prisoners like shadows. They were ordered to move logs, dig trenches, carry supplies, tasks meant not for labor but for humiliation. The slightest mistake could earn a blow from a rifle butt or days without food. Sam endured it quietly. He stopped counting the days and started measuring time in breaths. Every night he would take out the torn photograph of his wife and press it against his chest, whispering her name as though she might hear him through the wind that passed through the cracks of the hut. Hiroshi watched from a distance. He wasn't assigned to the same sector as Sam every day, but somehow, he always found himself nearby. He saw the American's slow decline, the limp, the bruises, the silent acceptance of pain. There was something unsettling about how calm the prisoner remained. Most men screamed, begged, or broke, but Sam simply endured. It confused Hiroshi and in some strange way shamed him. Here was a man the army called a savage, yet he carried himself with more dignity in defeat than many did in victory. The officers in the camp were harsher than the war itself. One in particular, a sergeant named Tanaka, had a fondness for cruelty disguised as discipline. He would slap prisoners for looking at him, mock their weakness, and make them repeat words in broken Japanese to humiliate them. Hiroshi had seen him beat a man until he could no longer stand, all for the crime of speaking without permission. The line between order and madness had vanished. One evening, Hiroshi saw Tanaka approach Sam's hut. He knew what was coming. The American had collapsed earlier that day during work duty, and Tanaka considered that an insult to authority. Hiroshi turned away, unable to watch, but the sound still reached him. The dull thud of wood striking flesh, the faint groan that followed. Later, when the camp fell quiet, Hiroshi returned to the hut under cover of night. Sam lay curled on the ground, breathing shallowly, his face swollen. The sight ignited something deep inside Hiroshi. Anger, pity, guilt. He couldn't tell which. He crouched beside the prisoner and whispered softly, "You, eat." From inside his coat, he pulled the handful of rice he had stolen earlier. Sam's eyes fluttered open, clouded with pain but filled with something else. Understanding. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Two enemies bound by war yet connected by something far older than it. Mercy. Sam took the rice with trembling hands, and Hiroshi nodded once before disappearing into the darkness. That night, Hiroshi didn't sleep. He lay awake listening to the sound of the guards' boots outside, wondering if they could hear his heart pounding. He knew what he had done was treason. But for the first time since leaving home, Hiroshi didn't feel like a soldier serving an empire. He felt like a man doing what was right. And in a place built entirely on cruelty, that feeling was a quiet act of rebellion. The night after Hiroshi first offered Sam the handful of rice, the winter wind swept through the camp like a whisper of death. The cold crept under the bamboo walls, turning the prisoner's breath into ghostly clouds that vanished before their eyes. Sam lay awake, shivering and weak, still clutching the small wooden bowl that once held the rice. It wasn't enough to fill him, but it was enough to remind him that someone, somewhere inside this hell, still saw him as human. That simple act had changed something inside both men. For Sam, it rekindled the will to live. For Hiroshi, it cracked the armor of obedience he had worn since the day he was drafted. The next morning, Hiroshi's hands trembled as he stood in line for roll call. He couldn't stop thinking about what he had done. If anyone had seen him, if a single word had reached the officers, he would have been executed without question. But when he glanced toward Sam's hut and saw the faint movement inside, a quiet relief settled over him. The American was still alive. And somehow that mattered more than his fear. Days passed. The snow fell heavier, food grew scarcer, and the cruelty intensified. Yet Hiroshi continued his silent rebellion. Each night he smuggled a few grains of rice or a piece of stale bread under his coat, slipping it into the shadows of Sam's cell when no one was looking. He never spoke more than a few words, but the silence between them became its own language, one of gratitude, of trust, of quiet defiance against a world gone mad. Sam began to change. Slowly, his strength returned. His breathing steadied, his eyes regained a faint spark, and when he looked at Hiroshi, it was not with fear or suspicion, but with something closer to respect. He didn't know the soldier's name, nor could he ask, but he understood enough. Every bite of food was a risk, every gesture a reminder that kindness still existed even in war's darkest corner. One evening, when the guards were drunk and loud, Hiroshi slipped into the hut with a small canteen of water. Sam was sitting upright for the first time in days. When Hiroshi placed the canteen down, Sam whispered hoarsely, "Thank you." The words were foreign, broken, but Hiroshi understood. He hesitated for a moment, then whispered back, "No, Dai. You must live." Their eyes met, one pair tired and grateful, the other young and filled with fear and determination. In that fleeting moment, the boundaries of enemy and ally disappeared. They were simply two men trying to hold on to the last fragments of humanity in a world intent on erasing it. That night, Hiroshi returned to his barracks unable to sleep. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled breathing of the other soldiers. For the first time, he felt the full weight of what he had done, not out of regret, but realization. In saving one life, he had begun to save his own soul. The war had taken everything from him, his peace, his innocence, his faith, but it could not take his choice to be human. That handful of rice, small as it was, had become his act of rebellion against the endless machinery of cruelty. It was mercy disguised as survival, and it was the beginning of something neither of them would ever forget. Over the weeks that followed, the unspoken bond between Hiroshi and Sam grew quietly in the shadows of the camp. Neither man dared to speak of it, but both felt it every time their eyes met through the cracks of the bamboo wall. War had stripped them of everything, freedom, pride, hope, but it hadn't managed to kill the one thing neither army could control: compassion. Each evening, when darkness fell and the guards' footsteps faded into the distance, Hiroshi would find a way to reach Sam's hut. Sometimes it was only a small portion of rice, sometimes a boiled potato, and once, on a bitterly cold night, he managed to sneak in a piece of dried fish. For Sam, these offerings were more than food. They were proof that mercy still existed in a world that seemed to have forgotten it. As Sam regained his strength, he began to observe Hiroshi more closely. The young soldier always moved with a kind of quiet urgency, glancing over his shoulder as though the shadows themselves might betray him. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice was soft, nothing like the angry shouts of the officers. There was a gentleness about him that seemed completely out of place amid the cruelty of the camp. One evening, when Hiroshi passed him the food through the wooden slats, Sam whispered, "Why?" His voice cracked from disuse, the single word heavy with meaning. Hiroshi hesitated, then answered in broken English, "Because you are man, like me." Those 6 words would stay with Sam for the rest of his life. They began to exchange fragments of their worlds through halting gestures and simple words. Hiroshi pointed to himself and said, "Hiroshi." Then he pointed to Sam, who placed a trembling hand on his chest and said, "Sam." It was the first time Hiroshi had heard the name. It sounded foreign, sharp, but he repeated it softly under his breath as if memorizing it. In return, Sam drew a small picture on the dusty floor. A circle for the sun, a line for the horizon, and beside it, a stick figure of a woman with a child. Hiroshi understood immediately. "Family," he said, and Sam nodded. For a moment, the 2 men smiled, an act so rare in that camp it felt almost forbidden. Hiroshi began to watch over Sam even during the day. He'd subtly intervene when officers grew suspicious, distracting them or volunteering for tasks that kept him near the prisoner's hut. Once, when Tanaka accused Sam of feigning illness, Hiroshi stepped forward to translate and softened the command, turning a potential beating into a warning. It was a dangerous dance, one mistake away from exposure, but Hiroshi no longer cared. Each day he spent helping Sam reminded him that he still possessed something sacred, his ability to choose kindness. Sam, too, began to change. His hatred, once burning like the engines of his crashed plane, began to fade. He stopped seeing Hiroshi as a uniform and started seeing him as a person, a frightened young man caught in a war neither of them had chosen. The 2 began to share brief moments of silence that felt strangely peaceful amid the screams and gunfire beyond the fence. In that stillness, they found something rare, understanding. The war outside raged on, cities burned, and men on both sides died for flags and orders. But inside that forgotten camp, 2 enemies carved out a fragile truce of their own, built not on politics or victory, but on something far older than war itself. It was friendship born in darkness, quiet and invisible, yet stronger than the hatred that surrounded them. By the early months of 1945, the war had begun to crumble around them. The Allied forces were advancing across the Pacific, and the once unshakable Japanese Empire was weakening under the relentless weight of bombs and hunger. The soldiers in the camp felt it before anyone said it aloud. Their orders became confused, the supply lines thinner and the officers more violent, desperate to maintain control over a world slipping from their hands. Rumors drifted through the freezing air like smoke. The Americans were coming. To Sam, those words should have meant salvation, but in the camp they brought only fear. Men who tried to hope often ended up dead. The nights grew longer, filled with the distant thunder of explosions that rolled through the mountains like the growl of a waking beast. The prisoners whispered prayers they barely believed in, clutching at the last fragments of faith that they might see home again. Sam, his body frail but his spirit slowly rekindled, began to dream, not of victory but of survival. Each time the sound of bombing echoed closer, he thought of Margaret, of the child he had never met, and of the strange young soldier who had kept him alive when all logic said he shouldn't. Hiroshi, too, felt the end approaching. The officers barked orders they didn't understand, talking of retreat, of moving prisoners inland, of erasing evidence. The tone of their voices was different now, no longer filled with pride but with panic. He knew what erasing evidence meant. It meant that if the Americans arrived too soon, the prisoners would never be found alive. That thought terrified him more than the enemy itself. One evening he overheard Sergeant Tanaka speaking to another officer about executing the captives if the camp came under attack. Hiroshi's stomach turned to ice. That night he found Sam awake, his back against the wall, eyes wide and alert. Without thinking, Hiroshi crouched beside him and whispered, "Tomorrow. Move. No, stay here." Sam frowned, struggling to understand. "Danger," Hiroshi said more firmly, placing his hand over his heart and then pointing toward the forest. "You go." Sam's throat tightened. He didn't know how or when, but he understood enough. The guard he had come to trust was trying to save him one last time. Before dawn, chaos erupted. Allied aircraft roared overhead, dropping bombs across the valley. The ground shook violently and fires broke out across the perimeter. Prisoners screamed, guards shouted orders, and smoke swallowed the sky. In the confusion, Hiroshi unlocked Sam's cell door, pressed a small piece of bread into his hand, and whispered, "Run." For a moment, they stood there, two men staring at each other, surrounded by the sound of war collapsing around them. Sam wanted to speak, to say thank you, to promise something, but no words came. Hiroshi only nodded, his eyes glistening with unspoken fear and hope. Then he turned and disappeared into the smoke. When the camp was finally liberated hours later, American troops found Sam among the survivors, half conscious, burned, but alive. He tried to tell them about the Japanese soldier who had helped him, but in the noise of war and rescue, no one listened. As the survivors were led away, Sam looked back through the smoke and rubble, searching for Hiroshi's face. For a brief moment he saw him, standing near the remnants of the fence, head bowed, his rifle hanging loosely at his side. Their eyes met for the last time. No salute, no words, just a quiet nod between two men who had saved each other in different ways. Then the soldiers pushed Sam forward, and the world moved on. The war would end soon, but neither man would ever forget the moment mercy triumphed over madness, even for just a breath in time. When the war finally ended, the world did not explode in celebration. It exhaled, exhausted and broken. Cities lay in ruins, families scattered, and millions of lives were left hanging between survival and memory. For Lieutenant Sam Carter, liberation did not mean peace. He was flown to a field hospital where doctors worked to repair the damage done by years of starvation and captivity. His body healed slowly, but the mind was another battlefield altogether. Each night he woke drenched in sweat, the sound of the camp echoing in his dreams, the clang of metal, the bark of commands, the face of the man who had kept him alive. While others cursed their captors, Sam thought only of one soldier. He didn't know his name, only that his kindness had been the one reason he was still breathing. When Sam finally returned home, the war seemed distant, like a nightmare told in daylight. America was rebuilding, celebrating victory, but he found little joy in parades or medals. The cheering crowds couldn't erase what he had seen. Margaret met him at the train station with tears and silence. The child he had dreamed of meeting was now walking, a small boy with his mother's eyes. Sam lifted him into his arms and for the first time since the crash felt something close to peace. Yet even as he tried to move on, the war lingered in small moments. In the way he hesitated before eating, in the way he flinched at sudden noises, in the way he looked east every morning, toward Japan. He told Margaret pieces of his story, though never all of it. He spoke of the camp, of hunger and darkness, but when he mentioned the Japanese guard, his voice softened. "He saved my life," he said quietly one night. "He didn't have to. He could have let me die like the others, but he didn't." There was a long pause before he added, "I hope he made it home." In those words, Margaret heard something she had not expected: gratitude. Not anger, not bitterness, but the simple recognition that kindness had crossed the line between enemies. Months later, when their second son was born, Sam knew exactly what to name him. He stood by the hospital bed, looking down at the sleeping baby in his wife's arms, and whispered, "Samuel Hiroshi Carter." Margaret looked up, puzzled. "Hiroshi?" she repeated. Sam smiled faintly. "For the man who saved me," he said. "If it weren't for him, I wouldn't be here. Neither would he." The name stayed, quietly carrying the weight of a bond that neither time nor distance could erase. Across the ocean, in a village slowly rebuilding from ashes, Hiroshi Nakamura also returned home. The war had ended not with victory but with surrender and shame. He found his father's fishing boat burned, his house reduced to rubble, and his mother aged by grief. He never spoke of what he had done during the war, not even to his family. When he married years later and had a son of his own, he gave him an unusual name, Samu. His wife asked what it meant, and he answered softly, "A friend's name." A man who lived, she never asked again. Two men half a world apart, both marked by war, each naming a child in memory of the other. They had met only for a short time, but that brief moment of mercy had stretched across oceans and generations, binding their lives forever. Neither knew it then, but the story of their shared humanity was not over. Fate had one more reunion left to give. Decades passed. The war that had once consumed the world faded into history books and memorials, its memories buried beneath the noise of modern life. Sam Carter grew old quietly, never seeking attention for what he had endured. He lived a modest life in Kansas, working as a mechanic, raising his 2 sons and spending long evenings sitting on the porch, staring at the sunset in silence. Every now and then, he would take out the worn photograph that had survived the crash and captivity, the same one Hiroshi had seen through the bars, and press it between his fingers, as if it still connected him to the man who had kept him alive. He never stopped wondering if that young Japanese soldier had survived the war, if he had gone home, if he had been punished for helping an enemy. He wrote letters to veteran organizations, to archives, even to the Red Cross, but the world had moved on. No records, no answers, just silence. When Sam died in 1987, his eldest son, also named Sam, found among his father's belongings a small journal with only a few lines written inside. The handwriting was shaky but clear. To the Japanese soldier who fed me when the world starved my hope. I lived because of you. I hope you did too. That was the first time his family fully understood the depth of what had happened in that forgotten camp. For years, young Sam carried those words with him like a mystery waiting to be solved. He became fascinated by Japan, its people, its culture, its history. When he grew older, he studied journalism and began researching prisoner of war stories, hoping to uncover what his father never could. In 1994, during his research, he came across a small article written by a Japanese historian documenting testimonies from former soldiers. One name stopped him cold: Hiroshi Nakamura, a former Imperial Army guard who had reportedly been punished after the war for leniency toward captives. The historian had included a quote from an old interview with Hiroshi himself. It read, "There was one prisoner I could not let die. I do not know his name, but I remember his eyes." The words hit Sam like lightning. He knew without a trace of doubt that this was the man his father had written about. Sam wrote a letter to the historian, who forwarded it to a small coastal village in Japan. Weeks passed, then months. Just as hope began to fade, an envelope arrived, yellowed, delicate, with a Japanese return address. Inside was a handwritten note in careful English. "My name is Hiroshi. I was a soldier long ago. I remember an American pilot who was kind to me. I am old now, but I would like to meet the son of my friend." The following spring, Sam traveled to Japan. He found Hiroshi living in a modest wooden house overlooking the sea. The old man was frail, his hands trembling, but when he saw Sam, his eyes filled with a light that time hadn't dimmed. They bowed deeply, neither able to speak at first. Finally, Hiroshi whispered, "You look like him." Sam nodded, tears in his eyes. "He never forgot you," he said. "He named me after you." For a long time, the two men sat together on the veranda, listening to the waves crash gently against the rocks. No translators, no ceremonies, just silence and peace. Before leaving, Sam handed Hiroshi his father's photograph. The old man held it close, his fingers shaking as he traced the edges. "He lived," Hiroshi said softly. "Then I am glad." That meeting lasted only one afternoon, but it healed something that had been broken for 50 years. 2 generations stood where their fathers had once stood. No longer enemies, no longer haunted. Just men bound by a single act of compassion that had outlived the war that tried to destroy it. When Sam returned home from Japan, he carried with him not just the photograph but something far greater: closure. For decades, his father's story had been one of survival. Now it was one of connection. The meeting with Hiroshi had given meaning to the silence that haunted his father's nights. It revealed that even in the darkest corners of war, compassion had found a way to breathe. The story of 2 men, an American pilot and a Japanese soldier, had come full circle, not in the roar of battle or the weight of medals, but in a quiet moment beside the sea. That moment, simple and wordless, said everything war could not. In the years that followed, Sam often spoke about that meeting at schools and community events. He would tell students that war was not just a clash of armies. It was a collision of ordinary people caught in impossible circumstances. He would hold up his father's photograph and Hiroshi's letter and say, "This is what humanity looks like when the world forgets it." Those who listened never forgot his words. Some cried, others simply sat in silence, realizing that history was not written only in victories and treaties, but in the fragile mercy shared between strangers. Hiroshi passed away a few years later. His son Samu sent a letter to the Carters written in careful English. "My father died peacefully. He kept your father's photograph beside his bed. He said he was ready because he had already met his friend again." Sam read the letter aloud to his family, his voice breaking at the last line. In that moment, he realized that his father's act of naming had not just honored a memory. It had built a bridge that spanned generations and nations. The story of Sam and Hiroshi is not about war. It's about what survives after it. It reminds us that even in an age of flags and divisions, the human heart speaks a universal language. Compassion, courage, and conscience, they are not limited by uniform or country. They exist quietly, in choices made when no one is watching, in the small acts that defy orders, in the decision to feed a stranger rather than hate him. It is in those moments that humanity writes its truest victories. And that is why this story matters. Because history often remembers the generals, the battles, and the bloodshed, but it rarely remembers the handfuls of rice, the stolen moments of mercy, the friendships that dared to exist between enemies. Yet those are the stories that show us who we are and who we could be. So as you finish hearing their story, take a moment to remember not the war, but the men who found peace within it. Ask yourself, if you were in Hiroshi's place, would you have done the same? If you were in Sam's, would you have trusted your enemy? The answer may not be easy, but it's the question that keeps our humanity alive. He named his son Sam, not to remember the pain, but to honor the mercy that outlasted it. And in doing so, he proved something history too often forgets. That even in war, the greatest victory is not survival. It's kindness.